Welcome to today's episode of Magnus Mindset Podcast, where it's our mission to help you grow in the skills, knowledge, and relationships to help you live your best. I'm your host, Tim Balo, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss another podcast episode. Some months ago, I had to take my daughter to urgent care because she had sustained an injury in her leg that actually resulted in her needing to have 5 stitches. Now, as I sat with her in the urgent care and in the treatment room, I was reminded of the time that when I was a child, I also had an incident that required 15 stitches in my elbow, resulting from an incident with stairs and a broken mirror. I was also reminded of another trip to the emergency room in elementary school where I had broken both of my wrists simultaneously out at recess. Well, today we're talking about a very difficult topic, and that is trauma. And some of us, we often think of just trauma as being physical, like some kind of a physical injury or some kind of a physical event. And while trauma can certainly be physical, it also can be very emotional, very spiritual, and certainly very mental. And many of you have endured some severe trauma in your time. It may have been perhaps a physical incident resulting in pain, but oftentimes it comes as a result of trials, heartbreak, and even abuse. So let's begin by defining trauma. Is it just about the event? Well, not really. It really is our response to the deeply disturbing or distressing event. Trauma is really an emotional response that lasts so much longer after the event occurs that it causes significant mental and even sometimes physical stress. And while the wounds that you have on the outside, the wounds that you have on the inside, the wounds that people can't see, are often the ones that hurt much longer and outlast those wounds that you can see. And while you might be living with this hurt and the deep wounds and even the horrible experience recurring in your mind, many well-meaning people might misquote a Bible verse from the New Testament from Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that says, all things work together for good. Well, the actual verse says that we know all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And while that may be a true statement, it is not always helpful, at least not yet. Not while you are dealing with the shock, perhaps the denial, the moodiness, the anxiety, the numbness, or even perhaps the guilt. I know in past generations they had a very different experience when it came to trauma. They often would just say, hey, you just need to get over it. It wasn't that bad. You just need to walk it off. You need to, rub some dirt in it. You just got to get over it, right? Well, the reality is we recognize in today's world of science and understanding of the mind that you don't just simply get over trauma, but you can heal from it. So in this episode, I want for us to, first of all, just build a foundation of understanding of what is trauma, and second, to show you a prescription on how you can pursue some healing. So first, let's define what trauma is. I would suggest these 3 types of trauma. One is the acute trauma. This is a response from perhaps a one-time traumatic event. That might involve a car accident, some kind of a natural disaster, perhaps military service, or some kind of an attack or assault upon your person. There's also the other side of maybe something that might affect you or might not as much as it does others, and that would include like the loss of a pet, maybe the sudden need to move or relocate, or even in the case of a divorce, broken relationship. Second kind of trauma that we would experience would be a chronic trauma, and that is a long-term response from prolonged or repeated events. This is where we find ourselves that we were growing up in a financially destitute environment. Perhaps you were bullied as a child growing up or even as an adult. You might have faced racism. Maybe mom or dad was alcoholic and played that out in your home. Perhaps it was sexual abuse or even exposure to pornography. The third type of trauma is what we would call complex, which is a response to multiple and ongoing events, which is usually some kind of a combination of the 2 prior that we've talked about, acute and chronic. It's something that you see that you were maybe raised in that environment, or perhaps you're seeing that environment played out in your own life now in a marriage or in a relationship or wherever your world is. Now, these experiences, these traumas, can really change how we see people and how we see life. For instance, we live in the state of Michigan, and in Michigan there are a lot of deer, and new drivers will often have their first time experience hitting a deer. When you hit a deer, it changes how you drive. It changes your experience in driving. It changes your approach to driving, particularly at night. You are far more cautious and perhaps maybe a little anxious as you drive. That can change not only your perception of your surroundings, but how you live life. And depending on the trauma that you experience, that could make you perhaps anxious when there's, say, bad weather or crowds of people. Maybe you get anxious at heights or other circumstances. It may have produced in you some anxiety because of financial scarcity. It may cause you to find difficulty in trusting people. And if you were perhaps a victim of abuse, you might actually fear for your own children or for those around you. But here's the big question we want to answer today, if we can, is then how do we heal? How do we move forward from this experience? Well, I'm going to suggest to you 3 different steps that we could put into practice to help us to be able to move forward on this. Number 1, we want to process the pain of our trauma. We want to process the pain of our trauma. If you want to start to heal, then you really need to process that trauma. That might be sitting down with someone that is experienced in this. This might be the kind of thing where you would go to a professional therapist or speak with someone who else has experienced this and has some wisdom that can offer some insights into what it is that you're feeling. You're not going to heal if you just simply choose to ignore, suppress, or forget. Going back to our previous analogy of the stitches, or in my case, my broken wrists, if we had simply ignored my injuries, I would not have been able to heal correctly. My daughter's wound would not have been able to heal correctly. We simply cannot ignore it. We find those who have maybe some training or some expertise in those areas who can offer help and support. So we need to recognize that I was, and then whatever that trauma might be. I experienced this, it did happen, and now I'm going to start processing the pain of that trauma. There's reasons why we typically bury those feelings because, well, let's be quite honest, it makes us feel vulnerable. Perhaps it makes us feel helpless. So instead of maybe seeking a connection in those regards, we often prioritize protection of ourselves. And we simply cannot heal in isolation. We do heal best in community, knowing that we are not alone. And oftentimes what happens when we try to maybe go about this on our own, we end up choosing something else to help us cope, we think. Perhaps we might turn to work. We might indulge in extracurricular hobbies. Sometimes those behaviors are even more destructive than that, like drug abuse or alcohol abuse or the abuse of sex inside relationships. Well, I want to encourage you to consider whatever that trauma is that you need to process the pain with some trusted friends, perhaps a trained counselor, a pastor, a spiritual advisor. You process the pain of the trauma. Number 2, we press on despite our trauma. We use phrases when it comes to these incidences that, well, it wasn't fair and it shouldn't have happened. It's not my fault and I don't know what to do. And now I don't know how to heal. When we're pressing on from our trauma, we have to recognize the 3 points of our story. And that is, number 1, our past. Recognize, as we said in the first section, that it did happen and nothing can change my past. So if nothing can change my past, then where does that put me in the present? You need to get out of a situation if it is an ongoing, as we were discussing previously, the kinds of pain, if you are in a chronic or complex traumatic situation where it is ongoing, you need to get out of that situation if you have not already. Or recognize that you are in a safe place now. The trauma happened in the past but is not occurring now. And then what about the future? Well, that's where hope comes in. We press on because we are hoping, we are seeing, literally envisioning a brighter tomorrow. And while nothing can change your past, you can heal from your broken heart. We would encourage you to consider proper therapy, self-care, and more, because there is a path forward. Number 3, we pursue purpose in that trauma. We can be hesitant to talk about these kinds of things, knowing that if you're hurting and you might even hate to hear this last part. Perhaps for you, you're saying, no, it's too soon, I'm not ready yet. But you can be healed. And it can also make you stronger. Make you stronger in those areas. It can make you stronger for helping someone else. When you experience a physical injury, oftentimes a broken bone is strongest at the point at where it was broken. I know that I have been through certain elements of trauma, and I have found healing through those kinds of things. Your trauma can help even to save someone else, knowing that they're not alone. But know this, that while your trauma may not have been your fault, pursuing healing is your responsibility. We've been hurt, but we can heal. We don't simply get over it. We heal from it because we are warriors. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure that you share it with a friend. Again, remember to click subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the episodes of this podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.